this side, so that Susan and Susan. You change seats. No, now you chair. You are there. So Marco is the next speaker. You can go. That's it. So that both the chairs are together. As much as you want. And we have to finish by 12:30, and there will be like Ranja, she has worked on. We have a front as the present drafts of Indo-EU trade agreement. We have a front against that. So maybe she will make from the floor those inputs. Ritu, if she is able to do something on health, public health issues and European debates, climate crisis debates, Soumya is there. So after Marco, all these friends, DK Giri is our expert on the Nordic region, so he can also come in. So Marco and then all these friends.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe I introduce myself again briefly. Many new people have entered. So my name is Marko Ulvila, and I currently work at the European Parliament for the Green Group, specifically for the Green MEP Satu Hassi, with whom I also worked more than 10 years ago when she was Minister for Environment and Development Cooperation of Finland. And for the past 15 years I've been engaged quite a bit with Indian movements and think tanks, with Lokayan, CSTS, and maybe 10 years ago we set up this network called Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, presenting sort of a comprehensive democracy perspective for a transformation. And in that context we have engaged quite a bit with the World Social Forum process in India and globally and Europe as well. I feel really privileged to be here with you all again, and speaking after this comprehensive presentation will be both easy and difficult, that most of the facts have been laid out very, very clearly. But I think I'll be very brief, so we have time for questions and comments. So maybe I'll start with the sort of big picture. That these two world wars, now it's 100 years ago since the World War I started, and so that is part of the European debate, European imaginary, somehow reflected also on these elections. But if we look at the still longer history, the past 5 centuries, like when Europe became a global power, 500 years ago, the circumstances were quite similar in places like India, China or Europe. The population densities and resources and technologies, but somehow Europe became a global player and China and India not. And maybe one explanation for that was violence, that Europeans, the Chinese invented the gunpowder, but Europeans have lied in a big way. So the conquest and colonization of well, first Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and so maybe that kind of violent ethos or inclination to violence backfired in 19th century. That Europe became born to these very devastating wars, which became then world wars. Also has transformed or has been then in a bit of a transformation, that Europe has maybe learned the lessons, and then this idea of at this peace at home has been part of the European project, and that I think is important in thinking that is Europe an international power or not? And I think for rest of the world it's probably better if Europe is not, because last time, like in 1848, the Berlin Conference, when Europe was strong. They divided Africa, that France would colonize these parts and UK would colonize these parts and Germany these parts. So at worst, being a big power can mean bad news for rest of the world. But I think in the European thinking, especially among those in sort of progressive parties like left and Greens, there's this idea also that Europe should become big and powerful because we are at least nicer than the US or China. We are more inclined to democracy or human rights or environmental sensibility or so on. But I think these need to be debated and tested against some evidence and not be pursued just as ideas. Well, currently, like was said, European Union is not a federal state or a unitary establishment like let's say India or US. That, for example, the budget of the European Union is about 1% of the EU GDP. So with that 1%, of course, the European Union cannot do all that much. So in that sense, it's still small and dealing only with some things. Well, if I now move into the kind of debates in Europe, and it's true what Professor Sacheva said, that even in Europe is not very known or discussed. That the so-called European project of integration, it has been quite elite affair and driven through sort of the economic integration the way described. But there are some occasions when Europe gets debated in the EU countries and constituencies, and maybe the most interesting bits have been the referenda on the European treaties. That the European Union, every 5 or 10 years, there's a process for a new treaty, which sort of establishes a bit of like a constitution for the region. And in some countries, like in Ireland and Denmark, they are constitutionally required to pass a referendum when these powers are transferred from the national state to the European Union. And in some countries, then for political reasons, they are subject to referendum, like in France and Netherlands in the last round. And before this so-called present, the Lisbon Treaty, there was the process for a European constitution with an elite body drafting the text, and then basically all governments agreed to it, but then the referendum in these 4 countries, it was rejected. And at that time, in France, for example, or in the Netherlands, there was really, whether it's not constitutionally required, but it was a political choice, then people really got into this question that what is the Europe and what do we want out of it, and then people actually read the draft constitution and said then no, and this kind of democratic processes have been quite important in putting some checks and balances in the way the integration is moving on. And of course the other time is the European Parliament elections, but that doesn't really happen in the same, I would say, degree of seriousness. One thing is that in many countries they are held at the same time with some national or local elections. So then the debates tend to focus on those ones, and even if it's a standalone European Parliament elections like in Finland, then normally it's sort of domestic issues, government, opposition, which dominate the debate. But I think this time it's a bit different because the European Parliament has got much more powers in this Lisbon Treaty, and people sort of have got the sense through the economic crisis that these things do matter. So there's, I think, more informed European debate now in the European Parliament elections than 5 years ago. And if we look at the issues that now are debated, I think the one, I mean, which has been there throughout, this question about the presence of the European union, like how deep the integration should be, how much the enlargement should move on as far as new countries joining in. And I think that there's the kind of setup that at the center of the political spectrum, both the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, the EPP and the SD parties, have been in favor of both integration and enlargement, and this is how it has been possible for the past 50 years or so. And then there's a critique, one set of critique from the left, which sees this as a sort of capitalist or integration in capitalist terms, driven by corporate power, and therefore there's the sort of left resistance to further integration, and for doing it very differently. And then there's sort of nationalist, rightist resistance, where, for example, issues like migration play an important role, and these groups sort of reject the idea of a further European integration. And in the current elections, I think what we see is the rise of both tendencies that the polls predict quite remarkable increase for the nationalist right parties, and also for the extreme left parties. So another thing is then the response to economic crisis that was presented here, and I think that generally the situation is a bit still the same as it was in 2008 when the Lehman Brothers bank collapsed and the economic crisis hit, especially the OECD countries, that nobody really knows what is happening and what should be done. That the responses of both the mainstream economists and sort of, well, from both right and left are not really adequate and dealing with the big issues. So now it seems that for the time being, at least the worst scenarios for the Eurozone and for the EU has been prevented. That there's some stabilization in the Eurozone, so-called confidence is back, but still the main indicators for GDP and growth are not really there, and countries like Italy and France, which were sort of next in line for this sovereign debt crisis, are still there. And in my understanding, the problem is that the European economies and societies, like most societies, are built on economic growth. So when there's growth, things run nicely, and when there's no growth, then things become difficult. And here, just looking at the basic statistics from the past 50 years or so, shows that this is a long-term trend, that the per capita growth rates have been declining gradually since the 1950s. But because of growth, it's an ideological thing, and it's a sort of practical thing. These kind of trends are not really recognized, but we are taken by surprise by these developments, because sort of end of growth, and then, like, if you look at the economic discussion in Europe, there's hardly any reference to these kind of questions, that why growth has sort of come to an end, and how do we move on to a post-growth economy. So then issues like energy and demography and others would come to the fore. And in the crisis, it's really a crisis of the Eurozone, and I think there, well, many economists say that, oh, this is what we said, that if you have a common currency without real central bank, and and common economic policy, it will not work. And now what we see that it is not working, but because the euro is a political and ideological project as much as economic one, then this even the debate of dismantling of euro or some countries leaving the eurozone are there only in the sort of marginal but emerging groups. Like for example in Germany there's a new party formed called Alternative for Germany, where one of the main agendas is leaving euro, or maybe throwing some countries out of euro. I don't know how it would work. But this is a party established by some senior economists. So in some circles there's this thinking, or actually work being done, how the euro could also, the eurozone could also become smaller and not just larger. And in this debate, looking at some of the crisis countries in comparison is very useful. Or let's say Finland and Sweden, quite similar economies in the northern Europe. Finland is part of the eurozone and Sweden is not. And Sweden has sort of fared quite well in the economic crisis because they had their own central bank, they had their own exchange rate dynamics, whereas Finland went along with whatever eurozone was doing. And still, in a bigger picture, that the crisis hit very hard Ireland, and sort of island with the big financial sector, and Iceland, a country outside of the EU. And again, Ireland in the eurozone, Iceland totally out of the European framework, and Iceland has done much better. The unemployment rates are much lower, and many other indicators are much lower, that they let the investors lose in a bigger way, and did sort of many good creative things, and like a constitutional reform and so on. So these debates are there. On trade, like one of the few things where the European Union does exercise some powers domestically and globally is trade, and investment since the Lisbon Treaty. And if we look at the WTO process there, the European Union has been trying to be a driving force. That in the first WTO ministerial in 1996, European Commissioner came up with this idea of Millennium Round, that we shouldn't liberalize further and further through WTO, and then it became the Doha Round, and then now the Doha Round concluded with the mini agreement. So because of many good reasons, and maybe also some bad reasons, the global agreement on trade liberalization has not moved on much since the Uruguay round. And for India-EU trade and investment agreement, like you mentioned, it's been negotiated, and I don't know if it has been part of the national election debates here, but the Congress government sort of let it stall, that it has not moved on because of a number of issues which India has found uncomfortable. But now we will see if there will be a policy change here. But if we think of the European Parliament and the elections here, then I think the trade policies of the political parties is something that makes them apart. And there's an important precedent where the European Parliament did exercise its right in field of trade, and that's the global, or not the global, but the plurilateral agreement on basically on copyright and intellectual property, the ACTA agreement, which was negotiated and agreed by about a dozen OECD governments, but which the European Parliament rejected because there was a very big movement against this sort of freezing or sort of exposing the United States intellectual property regime globally. And the Greens have indicated for quite some time that the Greens would foresee a similar fate for the Canada agreement, which is almost done as far as negotiations are concerned, or the US trade and investment agreement, which has now started for the negotiations. And I think most of the European parties have some reference to the US this trade agreement, and like the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party are very favorable, the Socialists a bit cautious, and the Greens and the left against, and the rightist parties a bit strangely being quite positive. I mean, rightist anti-EU parties. So, and in the elections, one of the debates one of the topics which have got some attention is this TTIP, the US-EU trade and investment agreement, and there especially the provisions on state or investor-to-state dispute mechanisms, which was a hot topic already 20 years ago with an attempt of the OECD countries to do the multilateral agreement on investment, but which was luckily again stalled. Maybe just finally on security, that there is now since Lisbon this common foreign and security policy, which doesn't give much powers to the European Union, and it's an area that the member states and the European institutions have this sort of process of seeing what will really happen. But I think the fact is that the security policy is still and will be very much national, that France and UK will not give up their seats in the UN Security Councils for any kind of all-European representation, and Europe in EU, the NATO, basically like the United States, still has the very important security role, but it's not all European. Some countries like Finland and Sweden are not part of it. But now the developments in Ukraine are quite high on the European agenda. That the Russian move to annex the Crimea has caused worries in many places, and then there have been these calls for Europe to act more united. But I think the question is, what will they really, and like what would United Europe really do? Because Ukraine is there's a lot of domestic issues there, and there are no easy answers. Like what would the European response for the Russia relations be? So there's still a lot of homework to be done. But anyhow, the election campaigning is now on, and it's very interesting to get your questions and comments. The results will be out on the election day itself. So towards the midnight of 25th Sunday, the results will emerge, and I think what we see is like what we saw the prediction that the socialists and the conservatives will come out about equal in size, and probably there will be some kind of grand coalition happening, which is not very nice for a democratic process. But I think what has not maybe been emphasized here so much yet is this very strong rise of the populist right. For example, in the United Kingdom, the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, is polling #1 currently, and now we might ask, like, why is United Kingdom not independent? So it's very much a reaction to the European integration, and if we like looking at the EPP manifesto, it's pretty. There's a lot of reference clearly to the sentiment of the UK and also in other places for the populist anti-integration right. So what we probably see in the new parliament is that there is from both left and right a more extreme strength, and so the parties in the center, including Greens, will probably find more common ground with the sort of more established political forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, for giving a lot of insights into